Hello and welcome to the revision session, looking at whether Hitler became Chancellor mainly as a result of fear of communism. So we're going to be looking at the causes of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933, and whether he became Chancellor mainly as a result of fear of communism. So for the purpose of this revision video, I'm going to be arguing that actually the main reason that he was appointed Chancellor was not fear of communism, but in fact Goebbels propaganda, followed by Hitler himself, the Great Depression, then fear of communism, and finally Backstairs intrigue is the most significant reason why Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. In some ways, fear of communism did help Hitler to become Chancellor. For example, we know that the Red Front Fighters League engaged in frequent street battles with the Nazis and the police, and we know that there were around about 360,000 of them by 1932, and that did lead to them trying to take over areas of cities like the Wedding District of Berlin, which fell under KPD control, and that really worried lots of voters. We know that Papen was so worried about the KPD that he lifted the ban on the SA, on the brown shirts in June 1932, because he was so worried about the communist threat that he was willing to accept Hitler and his slightly extreme policies because he saw Hitler's growing popularity as a way to ally against the communists, and allowing him back into allowing his SA back onto the streets, sort of legalising them and what they stood for, did help Hitler's cause. However, we could argue that in a way this argument is limited. Hitler already had 37% of the Reichstag vote in April 1932 before Papen legalised the SA, and the SA is only a part of the Nazi party, the NSDAP. So perhaps his actions weren't that important, and fear of communism wasn't that important as a cause for people supporting them. And we know that the peak vote that the communists got, around 17% in November 1932, led many business leaders and middle class people to vote for the Nazi party, in particular the Mittelstand, the lower middle class, because they thought that the Nazis were the lesser of two evils. However, having said all this, there were divisions within the Nazi party itself. So the NSDAP, the National Socialist Party, has the word socialist in its name, and actually there were some Nazis, including an organisational leader called Gregor Strasser and his brother Otto Strasser, who thought that the Nazi party should be more socialist than it was. And this put off many middle class voters who were worried that what if the Nazi party turned out to support the communists in some way. And some of these Nazis, some like Gregor Strasser, actually supported a communist-led transport strike in Berlin in the 1930s. So those sorts of things actually show that fear of communism didn't entirely help Hitler in his fight to be Chancellor. In some ways, fear of communism actually held the National Socialist Party back slightly, especially because there were divisions within the Nazi Party itself. So in a way it helped. It did encourage some business leaders and middle class or Mittelstand, lower middle class people to vote for them. However, they were getting the vote in other ways, and actually there was a fear that there was a sort of branch of communism or socialism within the Nazi party, and that didn't help Hitler and his appointment as Chancellor. Goebbels' use of propaganda was probably more significant in helping Hitler to gain the votes that he needed in order to get enough of the vote in the Reichstag that he would be seen as a viable alternative to the other chancellors by Hindenburg. And he did this because he was constantly emphasising a link between the KPD and Jews and anti-Semitism and scapegoating them. He was clever about his propaganda. He blamed non-Germans and things like the Treaty of Versailles, and he made it clear that the link with the KPD went to Russia and things like that. And by blaming non-German people rather than people within Germany for problems, he gained more of a base of support. He's alienating less people. He had policies like Volksgemeinschaft that Hitler had talked about, this development of a people's community that was deliberately vague. They didn't define exactly what that meant. So the message that he gave in propaganda about the Nazis could be adapted for each audience. And we know that he was really clever about the way that he organised all of that. So, for example, he, as the Nazi propaganda chief, wrote a number of pamphlets on how Gauleiters, local leaders, should target and adapt propaganda for their local needs and audiences, including what kind of imagery they could use, the number of words that they should use. So famously he said that they should only use around 3 or 4 words maximum if they're talking to a rural farming audience. He said that they should focus on a particular Nazi pledge, depending on who their audience was. So if they're talking to workers, it should be about food and bread and work and that kind of thing. If they're talking to families, then they're going to adapt their message accordingly. Many Gauleiters actually ignored anti-Semitism in their propaganda and focused instead on the promise of bread and work, because that appealed more at the time. So anti-Semitism didn't play a huge role in propaganda in getting Hitler elected as Chancellor at this period. In fact, there were 16 mass meetings just on employment and on nothing else. There were a number of rallies and marches which gave sort of an image of strength and discipline that overcame the problematic image of some of the SA brawls with the communists in the streets. Money was provided by big business, as so big businessmen like Huenberg and Tyson funded national campaigns, and in particular they funded travel by plane for Hitler, which enabled him to go around to all the major cities in Germany and speak to the people there, which had quite a significant impact on winning over lots of voters who felt that they were listened to by him. They had their own newspapers as well, which helped enormously. All of these things had significant impact in helping to win over voters for Hitler and the Nazi Party. And this tailoring of the promises of the Nazis to the voters really helped in a more significant way than just fear of communism in winning votes. Hitler had a fairly significant role as well in winning his position as Chancellor. And part of that was because he was a really good orator, a good speaker, and he made a number of different speeches in which he would adapt the speech depending on the audience, in a similar way to Goebbels arguing that people should adapt propaganda. So, for example, in January 1932, he made a 2.5-hour speech to 650 businessmen in Dusseldorf, where he didn't once mention the Jews or anti-Semitism. Whereas speeches he made to SA groups, to the brown shirts, were sort of labelled with things like down with the Jews and scapegoated them for the lack of jobs and things like that, especially when many of them were members of the working class. So he was quite clever at being able to adapt his speeches, and he was quite theatrical when he was speaking and did catch people's attention. And we know that he was a very good speaker and sort of focal point. He actually came second to Hindenburg in the presidential elections in 1932, so people did take him seriously. And they knew who he was. He had aggressive nationalism. His promise of Lebensraum and to get rid of the Treaty of Versailles was quite a popular idea at the time. And Führerprinzip, Hitler having total control over the party, he appeared stronger than the ineffective coalitions and the ineffective chancellors that hadn't really lasted more than a year or two at most, as chancellors recently in the Weimar Republic. Which is probably why he gained 37% of the seats in the Reichstag, 230 seats, which was the largest party in 1932. And Hitler himself pushes for that position as Chancellor. He doesn't have, although he has the most seats compared to other parties, he doesn't actually have a majority in 1932. But he still ends up being appointed Chancellor because he refuses to work with Papen as like a vice-chancellor. He wants to be the Chancellor himself. And by turning Papen down, Hindenburg has no one else left that he can appoint as Chancellor except Hitler. So he kind of, Hitler himself in his refusal to compromise and demanding that position as Chancellor and not accepting Vice-Chancellor, does have a role to play in his appointment. The Great Depression is also a more significant cause of Hitler being appointed Chancellor than fear of communism. And that's really seen in the votes. So, for example, 1928, before the Great Depression has happened, the Nazis only got 2.8% of the vote. By 1930, they already have 18% of the vote in Reichstag elections. The huge number of unemployed people, the lack of production and exports and things like that, and lots of young people feeling that their futures weren't secure, did cause a rise in people voting for the Nazi Party. However, it is limited in comparison to the role of propaganda. For example, we know that membership of the Hitler Youth and the SA was unstable, and that that's not the only reason people are turning to the Nazi Party, and it's propaganda that's winning them over and making them feel that Hitler is going to be able to win the votes and things like that. The Great Depression was one of the reasons that the communists gained in numbers themselves as well. So ultimately you could argue that the Great Depression was a more significant cause than the fear of communism, because the Great Depression caused fear of communism, because that's why there was a rise of communists. Finally, Backstairs intrigue. Sometimes this is emphasised as a really important reason that Hitler is made Chancellor, but I think actually it's maybe the least important reason that Hitler was appointed Chancellor. And the reason for that is as follows. It certainly is true that individuals like Dr. Otto Meissner and Oskar Hindenburg, the son of President Hindenburg, not to muddle them up, did play a role in putting Hitler in contact with Hindenburg and kind of putting that possibility out there that he could be the Chancellor. Otto Meissner was the head of the office of the President, and that was the case for Hindenburg and for Ebert actually previously. And he influenced Hindenburg and organised talks between Hitler and Papen. Hindenburg disliked Hitler, but after Papen's government failed, he kind of ran out of options. So you could argue that Meissner, yes, he did organise talks with Hitler and Papen and Hindenburg and kind of put people in the right place at the right time. However, he didn't win over Hindenburg with the arguments. The only reason that Hindenburg is turning to Hitler is because he really doesn't feel like he has any other options. Similarly, Oskar Hindenburg, son of the president, also controlled access to him due to his role as well. He initially opposed Hitler but changed his mind in January 1933 after discussions with Papen and Hitler, and starts to sort of share those views and allow access to President Hindenburg as well. But again, I would argue that this is a limited reason for Hitler being appointed Chancellor. The reason he's won over is because talks with Hitler go so well, so the propaganda and Hitler as an orator win him over, and that's a more important reason that he's given those opportunities rather than Backstairs intrigue. So certainly fear of communism is probably a more important cause. Had Hitler not got extra votes within the Reichstag, Hindenburg wouldn't be at all interested in Hitler, because he needed someone who was going to get enough support from the Reichstag that they could actually pass laws without necessarily turning back on Article 48 all the time. And in that way, failure of the chancellors did play a role in Hitler being appointed as Chancellor. Brüning had to use Article 48 115 times to try and pass laws because he couldn't get enough support from the Reichstag, and 6 million people were unemployed because of his rather unsuccessful policies dealing with the Great Depression, cutting government spending and things like that. Papen, there was an increase in street violence. He was sort of labelled as having a cabinet of barons because he basically put landowning and industrial elites in his cabinet and ignored the Reichstag and alienated his own centre party by agreeing even to be Chancellor, because Brüning had been centre party and he was centre party, and he kind of ousted Brüning from centre party. Schleicher failed to get Reichstag support as well. He'd cancelled wage cuts and benefit cuts and talked about breaking up large estates in the east, and giving it to smaller farmers and things like that, and then he scared off all the industrialists and business leaders that he needed support from in order to run the government. So you could argue that actually the failure of these other chancellors is the only reason that Hindenburg is actually turning to Hitler. It's not really due to Oscar Hindenburg and Dr. Meisner and people like that making clever suggestions. It's really more a case of he has run out of other options, and because Hitler has gained in popularity enough, he's got enough Reichstag support, Hindenburg is willing to entertain the possibility that Hitler should be appointed. It is true that people like Papen and Schleicher thought that Hitler would be easily controlled, and therefore may have encouraged Hindenburg to appoint him as Chancellor, but certainly in comparison to fear of communism, which did play a role in the increase in votes that Hitler got, and in particular propaganda and other elements there, Backstairs intrigue was the least significant reason for Hitler becoming Chancellor in 1933. So, in conclusion, was Hitler Chancellor mainly as a result of fear of communism? We would argue no. Fear of communism did play a role in gaining more votes from the lower middle class, the Mittelstand, and from business leaders. But actually, in a way, it also caused some upset with the breakaway groups as part of the Nazi Party early on. More significant in reasons for Hitler gaining that position as Chancellor was really Goebbels' very clever propaganda, Hitler's powers as an orator, and the Great Depression, which was sort of the catalyst. It created an environment where it was more likely that people would be interested in what Hitler had to say because they were disillusioned with the other parties. And Backstairs intrigue was the least significant. Fear of communism was more significant cause than that. So overall, Hitler became Chancellor as a result of Goebbels' propaganda and Hitler's powers as an orator, rather than because of fear of communism itself. I hope this revision session has been useful. I would highly recommend perhaps planning a slightly variation of this question, maybe thinking about whether you think it was inevitable that Hitler would become Chancellor after the Great Depression, for example. And considering the different factors, have a go at doing sort of 2-minute plans, or either doing that or maybe reducing this information down onto a flashcard, only including a few key bullet points for each one of these different factors that we have discussed, and keep practicing until you can remember it off by heart. Best of luck with your revision.